At some point in your 20s, someone handed you a very specific list. Go to college, get the degree, land the stable job, buy the house by 30, start the family, build the life. And you did everything right. You followed the list almost exactly. And then you looked up and realized the list was written for a world that no longer existed by the time you arrived in it. That's not a complaint. That's a psychological origin story. If you were born between 1980 and 1995, you are a millennial. And before that word triggers anything in you, the eye rolls, the avocado toast jokes, the participation trophy accusations. Understand that what's actually worth examining has nothing to do with any of that. It's something quieter, more structural, and more psychologically specific than any stereotype captures. You are the first generation in modern history to be promised more than your parents had, follow the exact instructions to get there, and still end up with measurably less. That gap between what you were told and what you found didn't just affect your bank account. It rewired how your brain handles expectation, trust, and what safety is even supposed to feel like. Here's where it started. You grew up in the most aggressively optimistic childhood environment any generation had ever been placed in. Every classroom told you that you were capable of anything. Every after-school special had a lesson about believing in yourself. Your parents, many of them shaped by the scarcity of the 70s, were determined to give you the confidence they never had. Psychologists studying this period describe a measurable cultural shift toward what they call high-expectation parenting, where children were consistently told their potential was unlimited and outcomes were a direct function of effort and belief. That sounds healthy. In some ways it was. But it also built a particular kind of psychological architecture that had no load-bearing wall for disappointment. When the world didn't respond to your effort the way the classroom said it would, there was no framework for that. Just a very clean, very quiet confusion that sat in your chest and didn't have a name yet. Then, September 11th happened. A huge portion of this generation was between 6 and 21 years old when the towers came down. And what happened psychologically in the years that followed was something researchers would later describe as collective threat sensitization, where an entire age group absorbs ambient fear at a developmental stage when the brain is still forming its basic model of how dangerous or safe the world is. This wasn't just a news event. For a generation that grew up being told the world was fundamentally full of possibility, it became a permanent crack in that foundation. The optimism didn't disappear, it just got complicated. And then came 2008. You need to understand the specific cruelty of the timing. The oldest millennials were 28, the youngest were 13. The ones in the middle, 22, 23, fresh degrees in hand, doing everything the list said, walked straight into the worst economic collapse since the Great Depression. Entry-level jobs evaporated, starting salaries compressed. The housing market, the one they'd been told was the goal, became either inaccessible or a trap, depending on which end of the crisis you were standing on. A study published in the Journal of Counselor Practice found that millennials entered the workforce carrying simultaneous student debt loads no previous generation had faced, into a job market that had fundamentally contracted, during a period of economic recovery that economists later confirmed disproportionately benefited older asset holders. You weren't failing to launch. The launch pad had been removed while you were still in midair. What this produced, neurologically, is something researchers call chronic, low-grade economic anxiety. Not the acute panic of immediate crisis, but a background hum of financial insecurity that doesn't fully switch off even when the circumstances improve. Studies show that adults who experience significant economic disruption during early adulthood show lasting changes in financial risk tolerance, decision-making patterns, and long-term planning capacity. You didn't become cautious because of your personality. The events of your early adulthood made caution the only rational response. But here's the thing about this generation that gets buried under the generational arguments. That same environment produced something specific that doesn't show up cleanly in any stat. You became fluent in uncertainty. Not comfortable with it, there's a difference, but fluent. You learned to navigate a world where the rules kept changing without warning, where the institutions you were told to trust revealed themselves as unreliable, where no single path was guaranteed. And what that built in you is a kind of structural adaptability that generations who had more stability simply never needed to develop. Research on psychological resilience consistently finds that people who have managed repeated, unpredictable adversity during formative years develop higher tolerance for ambiguity, the ability to keep functioning and making decisions even when outcomes are uncertain. That's not a small thing. In a world that has continued to become less predictable with every passing year, it turns out to be one of the most functional psychological traits a person can have. There's something else. This generation normalized something genuinely radical that the generations before it treated as weakness, talking about what's actually happening inside you. Millennials seek therapy at higher rates than any previous generation, not because they're more broken, because they decided, collectively and without a formal announcement, that pretending to be fine was a worse option than figuring out why you weren't. The American Psychological Association has documented a significant destigmatization of mental health treatment that tracks almost precisely with millennial adulthood. You didn't just benefit from that shift, you drove it. That will have consequences for every generation that comes after you, in ways that are going to take decades to fully understand. And underneath all of it, the debt, the recessions, the fractured promises, the very online existence that started exciting and ended exhausting, there is something that defines this generation more quietly and more truly than any of the louder narratives. You still believe things can be better, not naively, not the way you did at 8 years old when the classroom said anything was possible, but in a harder-earned, eyes-open way that has no illusions left and still hasn't given up. That combination, realism and continued investment, is actually rare. Most people, after enough disappointment, pick one. They either protect their hope by avoiding reality, or they protect their sanity by abandoning hope. You learned, through circumstances you didn't choose, to carry both at once. That's not a stereotype. That's not a talking point. That is a specific psychological outcome of a specific set of experiences, and it belongs entirely to the people who lived through them. You weren't given the world you were promised. You built a different one anyway, with the materials that were actually there. And if no one has said that clearly enough yet, here it is. If this landed somewhere true for you, subscribe. There's more where this came from.